The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Doris sat in her favorite chair by the window, a place where she'd spent countless afternoons over the years. The sunlight filtered through the half-drawn curtains, casting soft patterns on the floor. She'd always loved this time of day, quiet, calm, the world moving outside while she stayed still, observing. But today, the quiet felt oppressive. She glanced at the clock. 2:30 p.m. Ethan should have been here by now. He always called around this time, checking in, offering to run errands, sometimes just to chat. It was his way of staying connected, even if it didn't always feel like enough. But recently, the calls had become more sporadic, and the visits had dwindled. The last few weeks had been nothing more than empty promises of, "I'll be over tomorrow," that never came to fruition. Doris had started to notice the distance, more than just physical. Ethan's presence, once steady and reassuring, now felt like an echo in her life. When the front door creaked open, Doris didn't even look up. She already knew it wasn't Ethan. It was Lena, the nurse. Lena had been coming more frequently in the past few days, helping with the things Doris used to handle herself. Setting up her medication, making sure she ate, helping her to the bathroom when her legs gave out. At first, Doris had resisted. She had always prided herself on her independence, on doing things for herself. But now, the house felt full of strangers, and even though Lena had a kind face, it wasn't the same as Ethan's. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Johnson." Lena's soft voice broke through the quiet, and Doris finally turned to face her. "Afternoon," Doris said, her voice thick with the bitterness she couldn't quite hide. She studied Lena's face, looking for something familiar, something that would make this whole situation feel less like a foreign invasion. But she found nothing. Lena was professional, efficient, and gentle. But there was a hollowness in the way she moved, like she wasn't truly part of this world. Lena set her medical bag down on the coffee table and began to prepare Doris's medication. The routine was becoming painfully familiar. It wasn't the same as when Ethan had helped her. He'd always been impatient with the process, barely paying attention. But this felt different. It was like watching someone else take over your life, piece by piece, until all that was left was the hollow shell of what used to be. Doris wanted to say something, to tell Lena that she didn't need her here, that she wasn't a child to be cared for. But the words stuck in her throat. When the doorbell rang, Doris's heart gave a small, involuntary flutter. She thought it might be Ethan, but when she looked up, there was no sign of him. Just Lena, moving around her like a shadow. The nurse must have heard the bell too, but she didn't move to answer it. Doris sighed. Another part of her life, slipping away. Lena finished preparing the medication and came over to Doris. "It's time for your pill," she said softly, holding out a glass of water. Doris stared at it, then at Lena. A surge of frustration rose within her chest. "I don't need you to do that. I'm not an invalid," she said, her voice sharp despite herself. Lena's expression didn't change. She didn't seem surprised. "I know, Mrs. Johnson, but your son asked me to help." She held the glass out again, this time with a quiet, reassuring smile. Doris didn't take it. Instead, she looked at the window, at the trees swaying gently in the breeze, at the life outside that felt so far away. "Where's Ethan?" she asked, her voice cold now. The words left her mouth before she could stop them. "He'll be here later," Lena said, her tone still calm, unruffled. "He just wanted to make sure you were settled, that everything was taken care of." Doris's hands tightened on the arms of her chair. This was the moment. She could feel it, the thin thread of control she had left slipping away. She could refuse Lena, demand that she leave, insist that she wouldn't take her medicine until Ethan showed up. But she didn't. Her pride was all that she had left. "Just leave it then," Doris said, her voice distant now. "I'll manage." Lena didn't argue. She quietly left the glass of water on the table and stepped away, giving Doris space, though Doris didn't feel any more comfortable. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was growing, wider with each passing second. She was no longer the woman who raised Ethan, the mother who had been at the center of his world. She was just someone to be managed. For the first time in her life, Doris felt the weight of her age, the weight of her irrelevance. She wasn't the one in control anymore. She wasn't the one who mattered. The sound of the front door closing echoed down the hall, followed by the soft click of Lena's footsteps as she retreated to the kitchen. Doris sat in her chair, staring at the glass of water. The realization hit her all at once. Ethan had replaced her, and there was nothing she could do about it. But maybe, just maybe, there was one thing left. A plan that had been forming at the back of her mind for days now. A way to take control, to regain something she could call her own. With a slow, deliberate motion, Doris reached for the glass of water, the coldness of the glass biting into her palm. She stared at it for a long moment before raising it to her lips, taking a small sip. Tomorrow would be different. The days had started to bleed into one another, indistinguishable from the last. Doris sat by the window again, but this time, she wasn't watching the sun dip low in the sky or listening to the distant sounds of children playing outside. No, today the world felt muted, blanketed under a heavy fog she couldn't shake. The silence in the house seemed to stretch further, an insistent, gnawing presence that echoed through every empty room. Ethan hadn't called in 3 days. She couldn't even remember the last time he'd been here. Sure, Lena was still coming around every day, making sure Doris took her medication, cooking meals, and keeping the house in order. But it wasn't the same. It wasn't home. Doris couldn't shake the feeling that she had become an afterthought, a puzzle piece that no longer fit into the neat image of Ethan's life. The house, once full of their shared history, had become a place she merely inhabited. She'd never felt this far removed from it. This alone. The doorbell rang, breaking her reverie. But it wasn't Ethan. It was Lena, with her clipboard and a fresh, soft smile, offering no new news or comfort. "Afternoon, Mrs. Johnson," Lena said, stepping inside as if she had every right to be there. Doris nodded in acknowledgement, her eyes following Lena's every move. For the next hour, the familiar routine unfolded. Lena helped her to the couch, adjusted the pillows behind her, and started preparing another round of medication. The silence stretched between them like an invisible thread, thin, fragile, and unbearable. Doris couldn't remember a time when the house had felt so quiet. Lena, of course, was kind, patient, efficient. She was good at her job, but kindness only went so far. Doris saw the way Lena's eyes would flicker toward the door, toward the phone, as if waiting for some signal, some sign that Ethan would finally show up, that things would go back to normal. But they wouldn't. Doris knew that now. "He's busy," Doris muttered, almost to herself. Lena paused, her hands stilling for a moment, the quiet sigh escaping her lips betraying a brief flicker of empathy. "I'm sure he's just working hard, Mrs. Johnson. You know how it is." Doris didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention to the half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table, the ink lines fading beneath her fingertips. She didn't have the energy for it today. The silence that followed was too loud. Later, when Lena had left to prepare dinner in the kitchen, Doris called Martha. Her old friend's voice always seemed to anchor her, even on days like today, when the weight of everything felt too heavy to bear. "Hi, Doris. How's it going?" Doris hesitated before speaking, unsure how to phrase the heaviness in her chest. "Not good. He's hardly been around, Martha." I hardly see him anymore. And when I do, it's like he's avoiding me. Martha's tone softened, the concern evident. Oh, Doris. I'm sure he's just busy. You know how things can get. Work, responsibilities. Maybe he doesn't know how to deal with everything. Doris let out a bitter laugh, but it wasn't funny. I know. But it's not just that, Martha. It's like I've been replaced. And not just by a nurse, by the life he's building without me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Doris could almost hear Martha thinking, weighing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke. Give him time. He's your son, Doris. He'll come around. Doris didn't respond right away. She had heard it before. The reassurances that didn't seem to make the pain go away. Instead, she looked out the window, watching a bird land on the branch of a nearby tree. Its small body swayed with the wind, and Doris envied its freedom, its certainty in where it belonged. I don't know, Martha, she said quietly. I really don't. The phone call ended soon after, and Doris was left alone with her thoughts once again. She could hear Lena humming softly in the kitchen, but it felt far away, distant. Her presence wasn't quite a comfort. It was just another reminder of how much had changed. Ethan hadn't even asked her how she was doing. The doorbell rang again, a quick, sharp chime that startled Doris. For a fleeting moment, her heart jumped in her chest, but as Lena answered the door, the hope slipped away just as quickly as it had arrived. The visit, like the others, was brief. Lena chatted for a moment with the delivery person, then came back inside, a bag of groceries in hand. Doris barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the empty chair next to hers. The place where Ethan used to sit. He hadn't even sent a message today. No call, no visit, just nothing. A familiar ache spread through her chest as she looked at the empty space. It was all starting to feel too much like a goodbye, one she hadn't agreed to. Lena returned to the living room, placing the groceries on the counter and humming softly under her breath. She glanced at Doris before she spoke. Dinner's almost ready. I'll help you to the table when you're ready. But Doris didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the empty chair, the place where her son should have been. The absence of him was louder than anything Lena could say. Louder than the hum of the refrigerator, the clink of dishes, or the soft steps of Lena moving through the kitchen. It was deafening. Tomorrow, she realized, might be the same. And if she allowed it to go on, it could be worse. Maybe it was time for a new kind of silence, one where she no longer waited for Ethan, where she took control of the quiet, of the life she was losing. But could she? The clock ticked on. The office smelled faintly of old books and leather, of time spent in quiet deliberation. Samuel's office was always like this, neat, precise, filled with the kind of quiet that Doris had grown accustomed to. He was already seated at his desk, sorting through papers when she entered. He smiled at her, the same easy, practiced smile he always wore when they met. But today, Doris could see the weariness behind it. It mirrored her own. Doris, he greeted her, his voice warm but measured. I'm glad you came. Please, sit. She lowered herself into the chair across from his desk, the soft leather creaking beneath her. She had been here many times before, most often in happier circumstances, when they'd discuss a new contract or update her estate. But today, the air between them felt charged with something different. Samuel, she said quietly, her voice hoarse, I've been thinking about the will, and I think it's time to make some changes. Samuel's pen stilled in his hand. He looked up at her, his brow furrowing just slightly, sensing the shift in her tone. I see, he replied, leaning back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Is there something specific you have in mind? Doris glanced out the window, her eyes tracing the faintest lines of rain on the glass. She hated to admit it to herself, but she had been anticipating this moment for weeks. ever since Ethan started pulling away. The idea had solidified in her mind one evening when she'd sat alone, staring at the picture of Ethan as a child on the mantel, his bright smile forever frozen in time. The boy she'd loved so deeply was a stranger now. "It's Ethan," she said at last, the words feeling heavier than they had any right to. He's he's been distant. And it's not just the physical absence. It's the emotional one. He's practically abandoned me. And now he's replaced me. With Lena. With his work. With everything else." Samuel didn't say anything for a moment. He simply nodded, his expression sympathetic. He had known Doris for years, long enough to understand when her pain was more than just the passing aches of old age. "Doris," he said softly, "family dynamics can shift, especially as life changes. I've seen it before. Sometimes people distance themselves unintentionally, but I understand you're hurt, and you have every right to make the changes you feel are necessary." The words resonated in the stillness of the office, but they felt hollow. It was one thing to hear someone acknowledge the truth she'd been trying to ignore for months, and quite another to do something about it. "I've thought long and hard about this," Doris said, finally meeting his eyes. "I don't think he deserves my full inheritance anymore. Not after everything that's happened. Not after how he's treated me." Her voice cracked on the last words, and for a brief moment she was overwhelmed by the rush of anger and sorrow that she had been holding in for so long. Samuel's eyes softened as he pushed a file across the desk toward her. It was her current will, the one that still included Ethan in all the places he had been before. His share of the estate, the family heirlooms, everything she had once believed he deserved. But now, the thought of him inheriting anything from her felt wrong. She had given him everything, and in return, he had given her emptiness. "You're sure this is what you want?" Samuel asked gently, his voice cautious but supportive. "Making changes like this can create rifts, especially if Ethan finds out later." Doris's fingers hovered over the will. The weight of the decision bore down on her, but she felt an odd sense of clarity in that moment, like the fog that had been surrounding her for months was beginning to lift. Ethan's absence had already caused a rift. She wasn't sure it could be repaired anymore. "I'm sure," Doris said firmly, her voice regaining its strength. "I've been thinking about what I want my legacy to be. And it's not about giving everything to someone who doesn't even care enough to be here. I want to give more to the people who have been here for me, who haven't turned away." She pushed the file aside, her decision made. She was no longer the woman who allowed herself to be forgotten. No longer the mother who would put up with neglect because of her own guilt or fear of loss. She was going to take control, even if it meant turning away from the son who had once been her whole world. Samuel nodded again, his face serious. "I'll help you draft a new will. It won't be hard to adjust the terms to reflect your wishes. We can exclude Ethan from certain parts of the estate and redistribute those portions elsewhere, maybe to your close friends, or to charity." Doris thought about it for a moment. Martha would be the first to get something, a true friend who had never once let her down. And there were other people too. Those who had been kind to her, who had stayed, even when Ethan had disappeared. She would reward them, honor them. "Make the changes?" she said, her tone steady now. "Give more to those who have been here, to people who deserve it. I want Ethan to understand that he can't just show up when it's convenient. Not anymore." Samuel got to work immediately, typing up the revisions. As Doris watched him work, the weight in her chest lightened. She could feel the weight of control, the power of the decision settling into her bones. The truth was, she had been preparing herself for this moment for a long time. She had been rehearsing it in her mind, imagining the conversation she might have with Ethan when the time came. And even though she was still afraid of how he would react, the certainty that she was doing the right thing warmed her from within. As Samuel finished drafting the new will, he handed it over to her. Doris took it in her hands, feeling the weight of what she had just done. But as she turned it over in her hands, a thought lingered in the back of her mind, a quiet whisper she couldn't ignore. She had made her choice. But would it be enough? Would excluding Ethan from the will be enough to make him understand the depth of his betrayal? Tomorrow, she would find out. The phone rang in the quiet of the house, a shrill sound that broke the stillness. Doris hesitated for a moment before picking it up. Her heart beat a little faster, not because she was excited, but because she knew it was him. Ethan. She wiped her hands on her lap, taking a breath as she put the receiver to her ear. "Hi, Mom." Ethan's voice came through, distant but familiar. Doris could hear the clink of keys in the background, the murmur of other voices. He was busy. He always seemed to be busy now. "Ethan," Doris replied, her voice soft, almost tentative. She wanted to say something, something real, something to bridge the gap that had formed between them, but the words felt stuck, like a heavy stone lodged in her throat. "How are you doing?" he asked, but the question felt hollow. She could hear the disinterest in his tone, as if he was checking off an item on his to-do list. He didn't really care. She could feel it, and it made her chest tighten. "I'm fine," Doris said, the words slipping out automatically. She wasn't fine, but she couldn't bring herself to say otherwise. She wasn't ready to fight him. Not yet. She wasn't sure she even knew how to. "You sure?" Ethan pressed, his voice a little too eager, like he was hoping she would reassure him. "Yes," Doris replied, though her heart ached with the weight of the lie. "I'm fine, Ethan. Everything's fine." She could hear the faint relief in his voice when he responded. "Good. Good. Just wanted to check in. You know, with everything going on, I've been a bit swamped, but Lena's been taking care of you, right?" Doris's grip on the phone tightened. Lena, the nurse, the replacement, the woman who had taken her place in so many small ways, in ways Doris couldn't ignore anymore. "She's been fine," Doris said flatly, not bothering to elaborate further. She didn't need to explain how much it hurt to see Ethan's absence, to feel the space between them growing wider every day. She didn't need to remind him that she had been more than capable of managing without a stranger's help. "Good. Good," Ethan repeated, sounding relieved, as if that was all he needed to hear. "She's just temporary, Mom. I've told you that. She's just here to help out while I get things sorted with work. I'll be over soon. Just need to focus a little right now, you know?" Doris's stomach churned. Of course, he was still trying to downplay it, trying to reassure her in the only way he knew how. But it wasn't enough. She wasn't blind to what was happening. She could see the reality behind his words. Lena wasn't temporary. Lena was the new normal. "Don't worry about it," Doris said, her voice steady, though the words tasted bitter. "I understand." She didn't want to understand. She didn't want to be the mother who just accepted being pushed aside. But she had made her choice. She wouldn't fight him. Not yet. She had her pride after all. There was a pause, and Doris could almost feel Ethan's guilt from the other side of the line, though he didn't know how to express it. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Well, I'll be over in a couple of days. Maybe I'll bring lunch or something," Ethan said, his voice lighter now, more like his old self. The effort was obvious, but it wasn't enough to fool Doris anymore. "That's fine," she replied, already knowing he would cancel. She wasn't sure why she even bothered to agree to it anymore. After a brief, awkward goodbye, the call ended. Doris stared at the phone in her hand, the silence of the house crashing in around her like a wave. It was the same every time. The same empty promises, the same distant reassurances. And every time she felt herself sinking deeper into the silence. Ethan's absence was louder than his presence ever had been. She set the phone down and sat there for a long moment, her eyes focused on nothing in particular. A small noise from the kitchen broke her out of her reverie. It was Lena, moving about, doing what she did best, taking care of things. Doris didn't move immediately. Instead, she let the quiet wash over her. The sting of betrayal hadn't gone away, but she had learned something over the years. Time could dull the edges of pain, even if it never fully went away. When she finally stood, she made her way into the kitchen. Lena was there, humming softly to herself as she chopped vegetables for dinner. She looked up when Doris entered, her eyes softening as if to offer some unspoken comfort. "Dinner will be ready soon," Lena said, her voice gentle. Doris nodded, though she wasn't really listening. She wasn't hungry. She didn't want food. What she wanted was something she wasn't sure she could have anymore. A relationship with Ethan that didn't feel like an obligation. She wanted the son she once knew, not the stranger who had become a distant visitor in her life. Lena set the knife down and moved to the stove, her movements fluid, practiced. She was good at her job, and Doris appreciated that. For the first time, she wondered what it would have been like if things had been different. If Ethan had stayed the way he was. If she had never felt replaced. Doris shook her head, her fingers curling around the edge of the counter. It didn't matter now. Ethan had made his choice, and Doris had made hers. Martha had told her to talk to Ethan, to be patient. But Doris didn't want to be patient anymore. She didn't want to wait for someone who was never coming back. The air between her and Lena was filled with a kind of quiet understanding as Doris sat down at the table. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was. Tomorrow she would confront Ethan again. Maybe it would be different this time. Maybe she would say the things she had been holding in, but something told her it wouldn't be. The distance was already too great. The ink on the new will was still fresh when Doris sat down in her favorite chair, the one by the window. The room had a faint scent of lavender from the candle she'd lit earlier, the soft, golden light of late afternoon filtering in. But for once, she wasn't drawn to the window. She wasn't distracted by the movement outside, by the sounds of the neighborhood that had once filled her with comfort. Today, she was focused inward. The decision had been made. The changes were final. She glanced down at the papers in her lap. Her new will, rewritten with Samuel's guidance, now a reflection of her reality. Ethan had been excluded from nearly every part of the estate. The family heirlooms she had once intended to pass down to him. Gone. The house, once imagined as his inheritance, would now go to a local charity that helped seniors. And as for her other belongings, those would go to Martha, her oldest friend, and a few others who had never turned their backs on her. People who had shown up, even when her own son hadn't. It was what she had wanted all along, though the weight of it still felt heavy. She ran her fingers over the edges of the paper as though touching it might make the decision real, might give her some of the relief she so desperately needed. But there was no relief. Just a quiet, gnawing sense of finality. The door to the kitchen opened behind her and she turned, blinking as Lena stepped into the living room. Lena's expression softened when she saw Doris, as if she could sense the shift in the air, the quiet tension Doris was carrying. "You seem different," Lena said gently, offering her a small, observant smile. "More at peace. Did you get everything sorted?" Doris didn't answer immediately. She let the question hang in the air for a moment, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Lena had no idea what had happened. She was still the calm, efficient woman who moved through Doris's life with quiet grace, never pressing, never expecting more than what Doris was willing to give. "I did," Doris replied at last, her voice steady. "It's done now." Lena nodded, clearly satisfied that Doris had found some semblance of resolution. The nurse moved toward the couch, setting down the tray of tea she had brought in earlier. She glanced at Doris as she sat, but Doris didn't look at her. She was already lost in thought, her gaze fixed on the view outside, where the trees seemed to sway in the breeze, indifferent to the turmoil inside. Lena, perhaps sensing the emotional weight of the moment, didn't push. She simply sat there, quietly. Doris couldn't help but wonder what it would have been like if they had met under different circumstances. If Lena had been the one to fill a gap that hadn't existed. But there were too many what-ifs now. Too many roads that were already closed off. Ethan's absence continued to settle over Doris like a cloud she couldn't shake. It had been days since he'd been by. Days since he'd called. The only sign of him now was his empty promises, words that floated in the air between them, half-formed, never fully realized. The silence between Doris and Lena stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply the kind of quiet that felt earned, as if they had both accepted what was left. They both knew the other's thoughts without words needing to be spoken. That was the thing, Doris thought. She didn't need to hear Lena's reassurances. She didn't need more empty words from Ethan, promising to show up soon and pretending like things could go back to the way they had been. It wasn't enough. Nothing could be enough now. She looked down at the envelope on the table. It had been sitting there, waiting for Ethan. The letter she had written him. The one that explained everything. Her decision. The reasons behind it. She had debated whether to send it or even to hand it to him herself when he showed up. But that wasn't how it was going to happen. Doris knew it. And yet, as the days passed and he stayed away, the more it became clear that she couldn't just keep waiting. She couldn't just keep pretending. The letter would be the first step toward cutting ties. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a quiet, final acknowledgement that she deserved more than what he had been willing to give. She stood up, her body aching as she walked to the side table and picked up the envelope. The weight of it in her hand felt right, a small but meaningful sign of the changes she had made. She wasn't sure when she would give it to him. It didn't matter. The important part was that it was ready. "Dinner will be ready in a little while," Lena said, her voice breaking Doris's thoughts as she walked past the table. Doris nodded absent-mindedly. But her thoughts were already elsewhere. Ethan would be back soon. He would have to be. He was going to find out eventually. And when he did, when he finally opened the letter, would he understand? Would he accept it? She didn't know. But she was ready. She had to be. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow would be different. And in the silence that filled the room, Doris realized she was finally prepared to face whatever came next. The doorbell rang with an almost expected finality, its chime cutting through the stillness of the room. Doris's heart stilled for a moment, her breath held tight in her chest as she stood at the window, staring out into the fading light. It wasn't the first time Ethan had come by in the past few weeks, but it felt different this time. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the envelope resting on the table in front of her. The letter was finally ready. It had been days since she had made the decision to write it. Days of wrestling with the sting of abandonment, the ache of being pushed aside for a nurse and a career. But now, here it was. Everything she had held inside her for months, distilled into a few pages of words, each sentence an affirmation of what she knew needed to be done. She had written it clearly, without anger, without bitterness, just truth. The truth she had needed to say, but never had the chance to. Her feet moved without thinking, a slow, deliberate walk toward the door. The letter felt heavier in her hands now, like it was something she had carried with her for far longer than she had realized. Ethan was on the other side of that door, and she was ready. At least, she hoped she was. The door swung open to reveal Ethan standing on the porch. His face, always full of the familiar rush of responsibility, looked almost uncomfortable now, as if he wasn't quite sure how to stand in front of her anymore. He was still dressed in his work clothes, his sleeves rolled up, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. It hadn't for weeks. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice light, almost rehearsed. "I was thinking I'd stop by with some lunch, but I didn't want to disturb." Doris didn't let him finish. The silence between them stretched, long and uncomfortable. She stood there, holding the envelope between her fingers, her eyes focused on his face. Her heart didn't race anymore. It had already made its decision. "I've decided to make some changes," Doris said, her voice steady. Her hand shook slightly as she extended the letter toward him, her fingers brushing his as he reached to take it. The coolness of the paper in her hand sent a shiver down her spine. Ethan's brows furrowed slightly, his eyes flicking to the envelope as though he didn't understand what she was saying. But there was no mistaking the seriousness in her voice. "Changes?" he asked, his smile faltering for just a moment. "What do you mean?" Doris didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped aside, allowing him to come in. He didn't seem to notice the way the house was quieter now, how the air was different, as if it had been holding its breath for this moment. He only looked at her with a furrowed brow, trying to gauge her mood. "Read it," Doris said simply, her voice lower now, the words hanging in the air between them. Ethan hesitated, looking at the letter in his hand, then back at her. His gaze softened slightly, like he thought this was just another minor conversation to get through, another bump in the road. But Doris knew better. This was the moment. She watched him tear open the envelope with quick, distracted movements, his eyes scanning the paper as he read, the silence hanging thick. The tension between them built with every passing second, and Doris could feel the weight of the letter growing heavier in his hands. His face went pale. She saw the shift in his expression, the way his eyes widened slightly as he took in the contents, the disbelief crossing his features. "Mom." His voice was quiet, almost disbelieving. "What is this? You can't be serious." Doris remained standing in front of him, arms folded across her chest as she watched him struggle to process the words on the page. She had prepared herself for this. She had prepared for the way he would try to minimize it, for the justifications he would offer, for the anger that might rise to the surface. "I'm serious, Ethan," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. "You haven't been here. Not really. And I've been waiting for you to show up, but you didn't. And now I've made my decision." He shook his head, his mouth opening and closing, trying to find the right words. "But, Mom, you're just upset. This is about Lena, right? She's just here to help you while I get everything sorted. You know that. I've been overwhelmed. I thought you understood that." Doris took a slow step forward, her eyes locking onto his, her expression unyielding. "Love is not an obligation, Ethan. It's a commitment. And you failed me." His jaw tightened and he took a small step back, the weight of her words settling around him like a cloak. The hurt, the disappointment. It was all there, visible now. But Doris wasn't done. She needed to make him understand, even if he didn't want to. "You think Lena was just supposed to help? Is that it?" Doris continued, her voice soft but firm. "Help doesn't replace love, Ethan. It never will." His face reddened now, frustration seeping through his features. "I didn't replace you, Mom. I never meant to. I thought you'd be fine. I thought this was for the best. For you." Doris shook her head slowly. "For me? I don't need help, Ethan. I needed you." There was a long pause as the weight of her words hung between them, filling the empty space. Ethan's eyes darted away from hers, looking anywhere but at her, and Doris knew. He was already beginning to distance himself again, as if her words were too much for him to bear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed, the fight leaving him. "I don't know what to say, Mom," he muttered. "I never meant to hurt you." Doris didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Everything had already been said. As he stood there holding the letter in his hand, Doris turned away, feeling the distance between them settle deeper than it had ever been before. Tomorrow, when he left, the silence would be even louder. But she was ready for it. She had to be. It was done. And as Doris walked away from him, she realized there was no turning back now. The days after the letter felt like they stretched into infinity. Doris moved through them with an unsettling calm, like someone who had long ago accepted that the storm was already here. Ethan had not come by. Not once. She had expected as much, of course, but it didn't make the silence any easier. Instead, the house had grown quieter still, the space between them more palpable, and the echoes of his absence rang louder in her ears. She didn't let it show. She kept to her routine, sipping her tea by the window, taking short walks around the garden, attending to her small art projects. The ache in her chest had dulled, but it had settled into something else, a quiet resignation. Lena continued her duties with the same quiet efficiency. She came in the mornings, checked on Doris's medication, prepared her meals, and made sure the house stayed in order, but the connection between them, though comfortable, was still just that. A connection forged out of necessity, not familiarity. One afternoon, Lena entered the living room with a concerned expression on her face, a look Doris had grown used to seeing whenever something was off-kilter. She set down the tray of snacks she had brought in and turned to face Doris. "Is everything okay?" Lena asked softly, her eyes scanning Doris's face for signs of distress. "You've been awfully quiet these past few days." Doris smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, but it was enough. "I'm fine, Lena," she said, and it was the truth. She was fine. Not happy, not fulfilled, but fine. Lena didn't seem convinced, but she didn't push. Instead, she simply nodded and went about preparing the afternoon's tea. Doris could feel the weight of her eyes on her for a moment longer. But she didn't look up. She didn't need to. She wasn't about to tell Lena that it was Ethan's absence, Ethan's silence, that was starting to feel suffocating in its own way. The phone rang. Doris's stomach gave a small twist. She recognized the number immediately. It was Ethan. She hesitated just for a moment. Her fingers hovered over the receiver, but her resolve stayed firm. She had already done everything she could. The silence he had imposed between them had stretched for long enough. She wouldn't be the one to reach out again. When she picked up the phone, the conversation began before she even had a chance to greet him. "Mom, I've been thinking." Ethan's voice crackled through the line, urgent but strained. "I've been so caught up with work, and I know you're upset. I didn't mean to hurt you. I've been trying to handle everything. You have to know that." Doris sighed, a small, quiet sound that spoke volumes. She had heard this before. She had heard the excuses, the justifications, the half-hearted reassurances. They were all empty now. She wasn't sure what Ethan was expecting from her, what he thought he could say to make it right. "Ethan," she said calmly, her voice clear and steady. "Love isn't about convenience. It's about being present." She let the words sink in, letting the truth of them hang between them like an undeniable weight. "You weren't present. Not when it mattered." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Doris could hear him shift, perhaps trying to gather his thoughts, or perhaps simply too stunned by the weight of her words. She didn't care. She had said what needed to be said. And she wasn't going to apologize for it. "I was trying to help," Ethan said after a moment, his voice strained. Lena was just supposed to be there for you while I work things out. I didn't know you'd feel like this. Doris pressed the phone to her ear, not a flicker of emotion showing on her face. Lena is just a nurse, Ethan. She can help with the basics, but she can't replace love. She can't replace the connection we've lost. I didn't replace you. Ethan's voice rose, and for a moment Doris wondered if he was on the verge of tears. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought you'd be okay. But now you're acting like it's all my fault. You're punishing me. Doris's grip tightened around the receiver, but her tone didn't waver. I'm not punishing you, Ethan. I'm simply accepting what's been true for a long time. You're the one who distanced yourself, not me. You chose your work, your career, and your convenience over me. And now, I'm making a choice of my own. She paused, letting her words sink in. I'm fine, Doris said quietly, but I'm not waiting anymore. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. The words Ethan had been about to speak never came. She could hear his breath, shallow and quick, and then he let out a soft, frustrated sigh. I don't know what to say, Mom, he muttered. You don't need to say anything, Doris replied, her voice gentle but firm. I've heard enough. With that, the call ended. She didn't wait for him to apologize. She didn't wait for anything. The space between them had already become too vast, and it was no longer hers to fix. Lena, who had been waiting quietly, glanced at Doris as she hung up the phone. Her expression was full of something Doris couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or perhaps pity. But Doris didn't meet her gaze. She didn't need to. I'm fine, Doris said again, her voice steady, though her heart was quieter now, lighter. It's not you, Lena. It's him. Lena didn't respond, but Doris could feel the weight of her gaze. She didn't need to be reassured anymore. She was done with waiting, done with the excuses. The room fell into a heavy silence once more. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like peace. And Doris realized, in that moment, that she was finally ready to face whatever came next. The days seemed to stretch and bend into something unrecognizable now, as though time had slowly started to move differently in Doris's world. It was as if she had stepped out of the whirlwind of emotions that had kept her tethered to the past and into a still, quiet place where everything could be seen clearly, without the fog of expectations or regrets. At first, it was subtle. The way the sun warmed her skin as she stepped outside to tend to her small garden, the way she would sit at the kitchen table and sip her tea without a rush to fill the silence. She began to notice the small joys of everyday life. The sound of the kettle boiling, the hum of the fridge, the way the breeze would catch the curtains just enough to stir the air. All things she had once taken for granted. Things she'd forgotten about in the years of worrying over Ethan, of waiting for him to come around. But now, the weight of that waiting had finally lifted. One afternoon, Martha arrived at Doris's door, her smile warm and familiar. For the first time in months, Doris felt the true comfort of her friend's presence. Martha wasn't burdened by any need to fix things, and neither was Doris. They simply sat together, talking about anything and everything, laughing at old memories and sharing news of the small things that made life worth living. Doris hadn't realized how much she had missed this, how much she had been starved for genuine connection, the kind that had nothing to do with obligation or guilt. You know, Martha said as they sat together on the porch, I'm glad to see you like this. You seem lighter, Doris, like a weight's been taken off your shoulders. Doris smiled, her eyes softening as she looked at her dear friend. It's funny, she said, her voice quiet. I thought I'd feel lost without Ethan, but I feel freer. I feel like I've finally come into my own. For the first time in a long time, I'm not waiting for someone else to define me. Martha nodded, understanding perfectly. You've always been strong, Doris, but you've carried so much for so long. It's good to see you take a step back. Focus on what you need. Doris felt her chest loosen at Martha's words, as if her friend had confirmed what she had been feeling but hadn't yet voiced. It wasn't that she no longer loved Ethan or that she didn't wish things had been different, but the weight of his neglect, of the emotional toll it had taken on her, was no longer her burden to bear. Over the next few weeks, Doris began to fill her time with things she had put off for too long. She joined a local book club, enjoying the escape into different worlds, laughing with new people who were genuinely interested in her thoughts and ideas. She volunteered at a nearby community center, spending her afternoons helping with events and supporting others who, like her, were looking for connection and purpose. It was invigorating. She could feel herself blooming in ways she hadn't thought possible. And, slowly, Lena began to change from a nurse into something more, something Doris hadn't expected. They began to spend time together outside of appointments, having coffee in the afternoons, talking about their lives. Lena had her own stories, about her family, her own struggles, her joys. It was no longer just a professional relationship, but a true friendship that had developed between them. It was a comfort Doris hadn't known she needed, and it was something she cherished deeply. One evening, as Doris sat at the kitchen table sorting through some old papers, she noticed an envelope with Samuel's name on it. She had been expecting something from him, of course, but now that it had arrived, it still felt like another step in her new reality. She opened it carefully and began to read. The words were simple, confirming what Doris already knew. Ethan had been officially excluded from her estate. The will had been finalized. It was done. There would be no turning back, no second guessing. A part of her had feared this moment, feared that it would somehow feel like a final blow, a breaking point that would leave her raw and unhealed. But as she sat there, reading the letter, Doris realized that it didn't feel like an ending at all. It felt like the beginning of something new. She set the letter down and leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. The peace she had been searching for was finally here. Not because of Ethan's absence, not because of the will, but because of the quiet certainty that filled her heart. The past was no longer something she had to drag with her. It had been released, and in its place was the freedom to choose what came next. She could feel the subtle shift in her body, the way her muscles relaxed, the way her heart no longer carried that tight, unspoken weight. She was finally living her life for herself. Later that evening, Lena came over, as she did every day, with her usual smile. They sat together, sipping tea as they talked about their days. It wasn't just the casual exchange of pleasantries anymore. It was real, like the foundation of a true friendship. Doris found herself looking forward to these moments, to the warmth of companionship without expectation. As they spoke, Doris glanced out the window at the garden she had been tending to more frequently, the flowers blooming under her care. She thought about how much had changed, about the small but significant ways she had begun to take control of her own happiness. For the first time in a long time, Doris didn't feel the pull of the past or the weight of what had been lost. She simply felt whole. And as the evening stretched on, Doris smiled to herself, knowing that, for the first time in years, she was exactly where she needed to be. The knock on the door was tentative, uncertain, like the tap of someone unsure whether they should be there. Doris looked up from the book she had been reading, a soft smile on her lips as she set it down on the table. It had been weeks since she'd heard from Ethan, and even longer since she'd seen him in person. She didn't expect this visit, nor did she quite know how to feel about it. Part of her had accepted that he would never come, and in that quiet acceptance, she had found peace. She rose from her chair slowly, her body carrying the quiet weight of everything that had happened, everything that had been said. As she opened the door, she found Ethan standing there, his eyes downcast, his hands stuffed in his pockets, and his expression unreadable. "I need to talk to you, Mom," he said quietly, his voice heavy with something Doris couldn't place. Regret? Guilt? She didn't invite him in immediately. She didn't need to. She already knew what this moment was. "Come in, Ethan," she said, her tone as calm as the air around them. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter, but her gaze never left his face. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold, and Doris closed the door behind him with the softest of clicks. The house felt still. The silence between them was palpable, the kind of silence that held years of distance and unspoken truths. Ethan sat on the couch, but he didn't look at her. His hands fidgeted in his lap, his eyes flickering to the walls as if seeking somewhere to settle. Doris remained standing, her posture steady, her expression unchanged. She knew what was coming. She had already made her peace. There was nothing he could say that would change what she had decided. "I've been thinking," Ethan began, his words tentative, like he was trying to find the right ones. "I know I've been distant. I've been so caught up in everything. Work. My life. And I didn't mean for things to get this way. I never meant to hurt you." Doris stayed quiet, listening but not responding. Her eyes remained fixed on him, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Ethan's words, though laced with regret, were familiar, and she knew exactly what would follow. She had heard it all before, the excuses, the justifications. It didn't matter anymore. I didn't want it to be like this," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "You're my mother, and I failed you. I know that now." His gaze lifted briefly, catching hers for a moment before darting away again. "I'm sorry. I was overwhelmed. But I need you to know. I want to make it right." Doris exhaled slowly, not in anger, but in resignation. She had been expecting this, hoping perhaps, but also knowing deep down that it wouldn't change anything. She had already faced the truth of it. He looked up at her again, his eyes pleading now, a desperate edge creeping into his voice. "Mom, I'll do anything, anything to make this right. I'll be there for you. I swear I will. Just, please reconsider. Please don't push me away." The words hung in the air, and for a moment it felt as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for her answer. Ethan's desperation, the trembling edge to his voice, was real. He was scared, and Doris could see that. But it didn't matter. It wasn't enough. It hadn't been enough for a long time. She let the silence settle before she finally spoke. "The problem isn't just your absence, Ethan," Doris said quietly, but with unwavering certainty. She could feel the weight of her own words, feel the peace that had settled within her now, deeper than any pain. "The problem is that you never truly cared enough to show up. Not when I needed you." Her voice was calm, but there was a steel behind it, a quiet firmness that he couldn't ignore. The reality of her words hit him like a blow, and his breath caught in his chest. "You think apologizing will fix it? You think you can just waltz in here, after all this time, and make everything okay?" Doris continued, her gaze never leaving his face. "You stopped acting like my son a long time ago, Ethan, and now I have to accept that." Ethan's face faltered. The vulnerability he had shown, the fear in his eyes, was quickly replaced with something else, something more akin to frustration, and a flicker of anger that he tried to swallow. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Doris remained standing, her voice steady. "I can't keep waiting for you to figure it out. I've waited long enough, and I'm done. I'm not punishing you, but I can't be the one to fix this anymore." Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists in his lap. He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with a mix of anger and hurt. But there was something else there now. Something Doris had seen before. A part of him knew. He knew it was too late. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The house seemed to breathe around them, the silence growing louder. Ethan's frustration was palpable, but Doris didn't flinch. She had already made her peace. She had already accepted that this would be the last time they would have a conversation like this. Finally, he stood up, his posture stiff. "I don't know what else to say," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry, Mom. I really am. But I can't fix this." Doris nodded, her eyes softening, but she didn't move. "I know." He hesitated for a moment longer, then turned toward the door. Doris didn't follow him. She didn't need to. She had already let go. As the door closed behind him, Doris remained standing where she was, her body still, but her heart at peace. The finality of it felt like a release. She had done what she needed to do. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow, she would begin anew. Doris stood still for a long while, her eyes trained on the door that Ethan had just walked through. His retreating footsteps echoed softly down the hall, each one marking the end of something. She could feel the weight of the moment press down on her shoulders, but there was something else there too, a strange, unexpected sense of peace. The kind that doesn't arrive in a rush, but rather settles in, like a quiet tide receding after a storm. For a moment, Doris didn't know what to do. She stayed by the door, her hand still on the knob, her body stiff with the aftershock of everything that had just happened. But as the silence began to settle, she realized something. The future she had feared losing, the one that had seemed so distant and uncertain, was now wide open. The road ahead was hers to shape. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping the room. The house she had known for so long, the place she had shared with Ethan. It still felt like home, but it no longer felt like the place where she was waiting for something to change. No, that waiting was over. She wasn't bound by the past anymore. The house was hers again. Not as a place of longing or regret, but as a space where she could breathe and live. The first thing she did was walk to the small desk in the corner of the room where she had kept a stack of papers she had been meaning to look through. Among them was an old brochure she had saved for a painting class that had caught her eye months ago. She had pushed it aside, telling herself there would be time later. Later, when Ethan needed less. Later, when everything wasn't so complicated. But now, later had arrived. Doris smiled as she picked up the brochure, her fingers running over the glossy paper. The thought of painting, of expressing herself on a blank canvas, felt like a small but important act of reclaiming her own joy. She picked up the phone and dialed the number. The class was still open. In a week, she would start something entirely new, something that was all her own. It felt exhilarating. Her next step was simple, but necessary. She picked up the phone again, this time dialing Samuel's number. When he answered, his voice was familiar and reassuring, just as it had always been. She knew what she needed to say. "I'm ready, Samuel," Doris said, her voice steady. "I've finalized everything. I'm ready to move on with my life." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Doris could almost hear the warmth in Samuel's smile. He had always been there for her, quietly guiding her through the small decisions, the big ones. He had known her for years, and he knew this wasn't just about the will. It was about something deeper, something Doris had finally found within herself. "I'll make sure everything is in order, Doris," Samuel replied. "But I'm glad to hear it. You've made a strong decision, and I know you'll find peace with it." Doris hung up the phone, a feeling of finality settling over her like a soft blanket. She had done what needed to be done, and now she could breathe. The next day, she joined a book club at the local library. It felt a little awkward at first, meeting new people, stepping out of her comfort zone, but there was a warmth in the room, a shared love of stories that transcended any initial hesitation. As she listened to the group discuss the novel they were reading, Doris felt a flicker of something inside her. It wasn't just the thrill of a new social circle, it was the spark of a rediscovered passion for something she had once loved: reading. And, as the weeks passed, Doris began to carve out new rhythms for her life. She spent afternoons at the community center, organizing events and meeting others who, like her, were finding new purpose in their lives. She volunteered at local charity drives, finding fulfillment in giving back in ways she never had before. The connections she was building were real, rooted in mutual respect and understanding. She wasn't waiting for anyone's approval anymore. She was simply living. One evening, after a particularly fulfilling afternoon with the book club, Doris sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, flipping through old family albums. She had been putting this off for a while, unsure if she was ready to look back at the photos, at the memories that had once been so tightly tied to Ethan. But tonight, she felt strong enough. She turned the pages slowly, her eyes pausing at pictures of her younger self, of Ethan as a child, of the family she had built with such care and love. There were moments of joy captured in those photos, moments that didn't belong to the sorrow and frustration that had clouded the last years of her relationship with Ethan. She smiled at the pictures, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the life she had lived, even if it hadn't turned out the way she had hoped. And then, in the midst of that quiet reflection, it hit her. This wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't the end of her story. It was simply a new chapter, one where she could finally reclaim herself, where she could move forward without the weight of the past holding her back. She looked at the photo of Ethan, taken when he was no more than a boy, his wide eyes full of the innocence she had once cherished. A sense of peace washed over her. She had loved him with all her heart. She still did. But she wasn't going to let his absence define her anymore. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow she would start her painting class. She would paint not just for herself, but for all the possibilities that were still ahead of her. The past was over. And for the first time in a long time, Doris felt the thrill of a future she was finally ready to claim. She closed the album with a soft smile. The weight of the years lifted from her shoulders, knowing that the life she was about to build was entirely her own. The evening was alive with quiet conversations and the soft hum of music as Doris walked into the art gallery, the walls adorned with the vibrant works of local artists. She had attended before, but tonight it felt different. Tonight she wasn't just a spectator, she was a part of it all. The room was filled with familiar faces, some of whom she had met through the community center and her new circle of friends. There was warmth in their presence, a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was missing until she felt it now. Doris had submitted her work for the first time, unsure of what would come of it. A small collection of abstract paintings, bright colors and sweeping strokes that reflected the freedom she had finally embraced. When she entered the gallery, her eyes instinctively sought out her pieces, and when she found them, her heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in a long time: pride. She hadn't expected the attention her work was receiving. People stopped in front of her paintings, pausing to take them in, discussing the emotion and energy they conveyed. It wasn't just about the art itself, it was about the person behind it. Doris realized that, for the first time in years, she was being seen for who she truly was, not as Ethan's mother or a figure burdened by the past, but as Doris, a woman who had found her own voice again, a woman who had created something from her own heart. As she stood by the table with wine and hors d'oeuvres, a gallery attendant approached her. He was younger, his eyes bright with the excitement of the evening. "Excuse me, Ms. Johnson," he said with a polite but eager smile. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but your work is incredible. We're actually looking to feature a few new artists for our next exhibit. Would you be interested in showcasing some more pieces? Doris blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. Me? She asked, her voice softer than she intended. I'm honored, but, I'm not sure I'm ready for that. The attendant laughed, a friendly, encouraging sound. You're ready. Your paintings are vibrant. They speak to something real. We'd love to offer you the opportunity to exhibit in our next show. Doris stood there, a little stunned but filled with a warm sense of validation. This was more than just an art show. It was a chance for her to truly be part of the world she had once stepped away from. It wasn't about proving herself to anyone. It was about doing something for herself. And it felt right. Of course, she said, finally, a smile creeping onto her face. I'd love to. The conversation drifted away as she took another moment to absorb what had just happened. It felt surreal, but in the best possible way. She had found herself in a place she had never expected, a place where her passions were no longer tied to waiting, to hoping for something that would never come. This was Doris's time, her moment to be seen, to be respected for who she was, not for what she had given up. Later that evening, as she was leaving the gallery, she found a message on her phone. It was from Ethan. I understand your decision, Mom. I know you're angry, and I know I've hurt you. I'm sorry. I'll respect your choice, but I want to try and make things right. When you're ready, I'm here. Always. Doris read the message, her thumb lingering over the screen. She felt a brief flash of something. Maybe it was sorrow, or perhaps a sense of longing for what might have been, but it was fleeting. The words were kind, but they no longer had the power they once did. She had already made her peace with everything. She set the phone down, letting the message sit there for a moment. But instead of replying, Doris turned to Lena, who had joined her for the evening. The two of them had spent so many hours together now, and Doris had come to cherish Lena's presence. It was simple, this newfound friendship, but it was real, built on respect and care. Lena smiled at her, her expression full of warmth. You were amazing tonight, Doris. You've come so far. This is just the beginning. Doris nodded, her eyes lighting up with something new. It feels that way. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. They walked out into the cool night air together, the city lights glimmering in the distance. Doris felt an incredible sense of relief, of release. The weight of the past, of Ethan's absence, had finally been lifted. There was nothing more to prove. She had already begun to build the life she wanted, and it was beautiful in ways she had never imagined. The next day, Doris made a donation to a local charity that supported senior citizens in need. It was a small act, but it was one she knew would make a difference. She wanted to leave something meaningful behind, something that would outlive her. Her legacy, she realized, wasn't about what she could give to her son or what he had taken away from her. It was about creating something that mattered, something that could help others find their way the way she had. As the sun set that evening, Doris stood at the window, her heart full. She wasn't waiting anymore. She wasn't looking back. The future was hers now, and it was hers to claim. The road ahead was wide open, and for the first time in years, she was excited to see where it would lead. The letter had been sitting on Doris's desk for days. She had written it slowly, carefully, each word coming from a place of both clarity and sorrow. At first, she wasn't sure if she would send it. It had felt like a final goodbye, something that could close a door she wasn't ready to shut. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized it was necessary. Not just for Ethan, but for her too. She had carried the weight of unspoken words for so long, and now it was time to release them. Sitting at the desk, Doris folded the letter one final time, the soft rustle of paper breaking the silence of the room. She stared at the envelope, her name written neatly in her own hand. It was strange to see her own address on the front, as though it had been waiting there all along for this moment. She had already made peace with her decision. Sending the letter didn't feel like an act of anger, but of closure. Her mind drifted briefly to the last time she'd seen Ethan. His face, full of regret. His words, trembling with hope for reconciliation. She hadn't been moved. She hadn't needed him to make it right anymore. She'd already done that for herself. The doorbell rang, pulling Doris out of her reverie. She set the envelope down gently, smoothing the creases as though the act of doing so would make it more real. With a quiet exhale, she rose from her seat and made her way to the door. Standing on the other side was Samuel, the lawyer she had trusted for so long. He greeted her with a warm smile, but there was something in his eyes, an understanding, a quiet respect, that told Doris he knew this was the beginning of a new chapter in her life. "Good evening, Doris," Samuel said, stepping inside. "I just wanted to make sure everything is in order now that everything's been finalized." Doris nodded, ushering him inside. She didn't need to ask. She already knew that the paperwork was done, the will was in place, her decision solidified. Ethan was excluded, and Doris's legacy, what was truly hers to give, was now a matter of choice. "I know," she said, her voice calm but strong. "I'm ready, Samuel. Everything is set." Samuel glanced at the envelope she had left on the desk, then back at Doris. He didn't need to ask if she'd sent it. The look on her face said it all. Doris had closed the door on that chapter. "It's a big step," Samuel said quietly, folding his hands together, "but it's yours. And you're free now." Doris nodded again. The truth of it still felt foreign, but with every passing day it was becoming more real. She wasn't bound by the weight of Ethan's neglect, and she wasn't tied to any past version of herself. The road ahead was hers to walk, no longer shadowed by the fear of what could have been. As Samuel left, Doris returned to her desk and picked up the letter again. She had been meaning to mail it, but instead of walking to the mailbox, she found herself holding the envelope for a long while, feeling the weight of what she was about to send into the world. Her heart had softened over the weeks, but that didn't change the truth. She couldn't pretend anymore. With a steady hand, Doris wrote the address on the front, each letter a final acknowledgement that the past was past. She would never be able to go back to the way things were, and that was okay. She wasn't angry anymore. But she also couldn't let him back in. With a deep breath, Doris slipped the envelope into her purse and made her way outside, her footsteps light on the path leading to the mailbox. The world around her had changed in ways she had never imagined, and she was slowly coming to realize that it wasn't just Ethan who had to let go. It was her too. The legacy she had created was one of peace, not of regret. It was one of healing, not of holding on. She stood at the mailbox for a moment, staring at the envelope in her hand. The address was written in neat, decisive strokes. There was no need to hesitate. The mail slot clanged open, and Doris placed the letter inside. As the metal shutter closed, she felt a shift deep inside, a quiet, subtle release. There would be no more waiting. There would be no more wondering. It was done. Turning away from the mailbox, Doris smiled softly to herself. As she walked back to her house, she felt an overwhelming sense of freedom, the kind she hadn't known in years. The weight of the past, of everything she had carried for so long, had been lifted in one small but monumental gesture. The letter was gone, and with it, so was the last tether to a life she could never return to. She felt lighter with every step, as though the world was finally opening up for her, ready to welcome her with open arms. She didn't need to look back anymore. And that night, as Doris sat down with Martha to share a simple meal, her heart was full. Not because the past was perfect, but because she had learned to let go. She had learned that sometimes the greatest legacy we can leave is not what we've done for others, but what we've done for ourselves. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow would be another day to create something new. The doorbell rang once, then twice. Doris had been expecting this moment for days, but still, her pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of the silence in the house shift, the air tightening as if it, too, was holding its breath. She had already said everything that needed to be said to Ethan. Her heart had no room left for the apologies he always seemed to offer at the wrong time, in the wrong way. But somehow, here he was, standing on the other side of the door. She had decided long ago that this would be the last time they spoke about it. The last time he would have the chance to change her mind. Doris took a deep breath before crossing the room to the door. When she opened it, there he stood, looking almost like a stranger. His eyes were tired, the lines of his face deeper than she remembered. The man who had once been her son was now a reflection of someone she no longer recognized, someone she no longer knew how to reach. "Mom," Ethan began, his voice softer than usual, his hands nervously shoving into his pockets. "I know we've talked before, but I need to say something. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've hurt you, and I see that now. But I need you to understand. I didn't mean to." Doris held his gaze, but her body didn't betray her. She was still, standing firm in the doorway. Her hands, relaxed by her sides, were the only sign of her calm. Ethan stepped forward slightly, as though waiting for an invitation inside, but she didn't move to let him in. He didn't need to be in her space anymore. She nodded slowly, absorbing his words without reaction, letting them fall into the silence between them. She wasn't going to argue with him anymore. She had already said everything she needed to say. "I'm sorry," Ethan continued, his voice breaking a little, the weight of his regret palpable. "I thought you'd be fine. I thought it would all work out. And I just—" He trailed off, his hands now resting at his sides, his gaze faltering. "I never wanted it to end this way." Doris stayed quiet for a moment longer, the distance between them vast. She could feel the familiar ache of old wounds that hadn't yet healed, but it was different this time. She wasn't looking to mend anything. She was looking to set herself free. "You made your choices, Ethan," Doris finally said, her voice steady, unshaken. "You chose work, you chose convenience, you chose everything but me. And I gave you everything, every bit of myself, for years. But somewhere along the way, you replaced me with a nurse, with your responsibilities, with everything that came before your mother." Her voice softened slightly, but the firmness didn't waver. "I've already replaced you with peace." Ethan flinched, as if her words had struck a chord that he hadn't expected. His brow furrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like he was struggling to hold back something, frustration, or perhaps tears. But Doris didn't flinch. She stood her ground. "I'm not angry anymore," she continued, her voice calmer now, almost soothing, as though she were speaking to herself just as much as to him. "I'm at peace with this, Ethan. I've let go of what was, what could have been. I don't need any more apologies. I don't need you to fix it. It's done." The silence stretched between them, thick and undeniable. Ethan seemed to shrink under the weight of her words, his shoulders slumping just a little. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words never came. Doris took a slow step back, the space between them widening. She wasn't going to invite him into her home. Not today. Not anymore. "I can't keep living in the past," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And I can't wait for you to figure it out. I've waited long enough. I've spent too much of my life holding on to something that wasn't ever coming back." She paused, letting the finality of it sink in. "Goodbye, Ethan. I hope one day you understand why I had to make this choice, but I can't wait for that day. Not anymore." Ethan's eyes welled with something, sadness, regret, but he didn't say anything more. There was nothing left for him to say. His posture deflated, and Doris felt the weight of his absence settle around her like a quiet fog. Without another word, he turned, his footsteps slow and heavy as he walked back down the porch steps, the sound of his retreating steps marking the end of something that had once been so full of promise. Doris didn't watch him leave. She stayed in the doorway, her eyes closed for a moment, breathing deeply as if to ground herself in the reality of her decision. The sun was low in the sky, the evening air cool against her skin. It was a new chapter, one she was ready to write. As she closed the door behind her, she walked slowly into the kitchen, feeling the weight of everything fall away, little by little. The quiet was different now. It wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Doris stepped into the garden, her eyes taking in the familiar, blooming flowers she had nurtured with care. There was something about the act of tending to something, watching it grow and change, that made her feel grounded. It reminded her of everything she had reclaimed: her independence, her peace, her ability to choose. She stood for a long time, the last light of the day casting soft shadows on the flowers. The road ahead, whatever it might hold, was hers. Completely. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow, she would begin again. And for the first time in years, Doris felt a sense of freedom she had long forgotten. It was a peace that came from within, a peace she had given herself. The sun rose gently over the horizon, casting a soft glow through the window as Doris awoke. The light seemed to touch every corner of the room, every crevice that had once felt heavy with doubt and expectation. Today was different. Today felt like the beginning of something new, a promise of hope she had nearly forgotten. She stretched slowly, savoring the quiet peace of the morning, the world outside still calm, untouched. For the first time in years, Doris felt the weight of her life lifting, not because of anything that had happened to her, but because of everything she had allowed herself to let go of. The past, the grief, the hurt. It was still there, of course, but it no longer defined her. Her heart felt lighter and her breath deeper. She felt strong. After a simple breakfast, Doris stepped outside into her garden, the flowers she had nurtured in her solitude now blooming brilliantly. They were more than just plants. They were symbols of everything she had reclaimed. She had tended to them with the same care she had once poured into her relationship with Ethan, but now, her attention was focused inward. The garden was her space to grow, and it was thriving. Her mind wandered back to the decision she had made to start a new life, one that was solely hers to build. It wasn't about starting over, but about embracing the life she deserved, a life free of regret. With a smile, she picked up her phone, dialed the number she had been considering for a while, and scheduled her first art class for local seniors. Doris had always loved art but had never fully pursued it, always putting the needs of others first. Now, her passion had become a calling. She envisioned a space filled with laughter, creativity, and shared purpose, a place where others could reclaim their joy just as she had. She smiled as she hung up the phone. It felt right. The plan she had formed in bits and pieces over the past few weeks was finally falling into place. This was her way of giving back to the community that had supported her, and to herself. Lena continued to care for Doris, but their relationship had shifted. It was no longer one based on necessity, but built on friendship. Over coffee, they'd chat about life, about art, books, and their hopes for the future. Doris felt grateful for the connection they had built, so different from the emotional distance that had defined her relationship with Ethan. Lena was a trusted friend, someone she had come to rely on not because she was a nurse, but because she was a person who saw her, truly saw her, and respected her choices. A few weeks later, the first art class began. Doris felt a buzz of excitement she hadn't anticipated as she stood before a group of seniors eager to learn. They were so different from the people she'd known before, yet there was an undeniable bond between them. A bond forged in shared experience, in a desire to create something beautiful together. As she guided her students through the first lesson, Doris felt the weight of her own transformation. This wasn't just an art class. It was a space for them to express themselves, to find their own peace in the act of creation. It was, in its simplest form, a gift that Doris had given herself. Her small business took off quickly. Word of mouth spread, and soon Doris was teaching multiple classes, each one more fulfilling than the last. The community embraced her work, her creativity, her vision, and her life began to feel rich with meaning. Her legacy, she realized, wasn't just about what she had left for others. It was about the life she had reclaimed for herself, the life she had finally chosen to live. One afternoon, after a particularly successful class, Doris sat down with Lena in the cozy nook she had created in her home, a place filled with soft lighting and the vibrant colors of her paintings. She took a sip of tea, savoring the warmth that spread through her, and smiled as Lena spoke of her own future. "I think you found something beautiful here, Doris," Lena said, her voice soft but sure. "You're giving so much to people, and in return, you're creating a legacy of joy." Doris nodded, her heart full. "It's not just for them, Lena. It's for me too. For the first time in so long, I've finally stopped waiting for someone else to define me." Lena raised her cup to her lips, a quiet understanding passing between them. There was no need for words, no need for explanation. Doris had already made her choice. As the evening light waned, Doris sat back in her chair and looked out at her garden. It had been a year since she'd first begun to heal, to reclaim what she had once lost. She had not just found peace. She had found herself again. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She looked down and saw a message from a former student of her art class, a young woman who had started a small gallery to support local artists. Doris's paintings would be displayed in the upcoming exhibit. She hadn't expected this kind of recognition, yet here it was. Her art was now a part of the community's story, a testament to the strength and resilience that had defined her journey. She felt a thrill of pride, not for the accolade, but for the truth that this moment represented. She had built this life, this future, brick by brick. It was hers, all of it. Tomorrow she would begin again, just as she had before. But this time, it was with the knowledge that the road ahead, though unknown, was hers to shape. And for the first time in her life, Doris was excited to see where it would take her. The sun was high, casting a golden glow over Doris's garden as she stood among the flowers, watching them sway gently in the summer breeze. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and roses, a mix of sweetness and earth, and it filled her with a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had built this garden with her own two hands, had planted the seeds of renewal, and now it was flourishing. The beauty of it wasn't just in the flowers, it was in the life she had cultivated around them, a life that was uniquely hers. Her art classes had become more than just a hobby. They had become a cornerstone of the community, a place where seniors, many of whom had never picked up a paintbrush before, came together to create. Doris had taught them more than just technique. She had given them a space to express themselves, to reconnect with a joy that many had lost over the years. The classes were now a staple in the neighborhood, a testament to the power of rediscovery, and she was proud of what she had built. Doris had also been invited to speak at local events, sharing her story and her philosophy about the importance of independence in later years. She had never imagined herself standing before a crowd, speaking about strength and resilience. But here she was, doing just that. The room was always full of listeners, people who admired her not for the struggles she had faced, but for the grace and courage with which she had moved through them. One evening, as she was preparing for another talk, Doris received a message. It was from Ethan. It had been weeks since she'd last heard from him, and she had almost forgotten what his words sounded like. "Mom," the message began. "I know I haven't been the son you needed me to be. I've come to terms with my part in everything, and I know I hurt you. I'm sorry. I accept that this is where we are now. I hope one day we can talk, but I understand if that's not possible." Doris sat for a moment, her fingers still on the phone screen. She had expected this message, had known that he would eventually come to a place where he recognized his mistakes. But as she read the words, there was no ache in her chest, no longing for what could have been. The message, while heartfelt, no longer held the power it once would have. Doris had let go long ago. The peace she had found had nothing to do with Ethan's apology. It was about her own journey, her own choices. She put the phone down on the table and went back to what mattered: her art, her friends, her future. In the weeks that followed, Doris's business continued to thrive. She poured her heart into her work, and the joy of seeing her students grow and succeed was a reward she had never expected. They weren't just learning to paint, they were learning to live again, and Doris, in turn, was learning to live for herself. Lena, ever the trusted companion, continued to be a part of Doris's life. They spent more time together, both in and outside of the house, as friends who had found something rare in each other: respect, companionship, and a shared understanding of what it meant to embrace life fully, regardless of the circumstances that had come before. One evening, as the light began to fade and the cool air of the evening wrapped itself around Doris, she sat with a piece of paper in front of her. She had been thinking about her legacy, about what she wanted to leave behind. It wasn't about wealth or possessions, not anymore. It was about giving, about ensuring that the community that had supported her would continue to thrive, that others would have the opportunity to find the same healing she had. She decided to donate a portion of her estate to a local charity that helped senior citizens in need, ensuring that others could find the support and connection she had found in her own later years. It was a small gesture, but to Doris, it felt monumental. It was her way of saying that the work she had done was bigger than herself. It would continue, long after she was gone. As she signed the papers, Doris felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had done it. She had found her place in the world. And in doing so, she had created something far more lasting than any material legacy. The next morning, Doris woke up with a sense of quiet certainty. She had created the life she had once feared losing. She had found her strength, her voice, and her purpose. She was no longer defined by what had been lost. She was defined by what she had chosen to reclaim. Later that day, Doris took one last walk through her garden, the flowers now fully in bloom, a mirror of her own journey. As she walked among them, she realized that everything she had built, everything she had worked for, had been for this moment. The peace, the freedom, the knowledge that she had created a life worth living, one that had meaning, one that was hers to embrace. As she stood at the edge of the garden, the soft breeze playing with her hair, Doris smiled to herself. "I may have lost a son," she thought, "but I found a life worth living." And with that, she stepped forward into the future, no longer looking back.